It's been over a year since anger spilled onto the streets after Sri Lanka ran out of money. The aftershocks of the crisis, a struggle to survive, and hunger.
7 million Sri Lankans are currently living in poverty. That's a third of the population.
The pricing of medicines have actually gone up about 3 to 4-fold.
How did we get here? We got here because of excess debt. That's how Sri Lanka got into a debt trap.
At one point, our debt servicing was 100% of our revenue.
Sri Lanka is tackling a complicated debt restructuring.
Do you approve the report or not?
With a multitude of lenders.
西方国家的这个甩锅中国呀，实际上是在掩盖自己在这些国家的真正的罪责。
And for the 17th time, Sri Lanka is asking the International Monetary Fund for help.
Now, what is the end goal of the IMF program? Is it to go back to the international creditors?
As the country tries to find its way out of default, experts warn of a contagion of debt distress far and wide.
The IMF is seeing 70 countries as potentially the next Sri Lankas out there, and we really have to act and act urgently.
Deconstructing a debt default that triggered alarm bells around the globe. Can Sri Lanka change course and show the way forward? This place is a lifeline for cancer patients in Sri Lanka, desperate to get hold of medications in short supply while prices rise.
මතු ලොකු මුදලක් වුණොත් ඉතින් හොයන්න විදියක් නැහැ ඉතින්. ගන්න ඉතින් කවුරු හරි පිටක් වුණොත් තමයි ඒක කරගන්න වෙන්නේ. නැත්නම් ඉතින් ගන්න බැරි වෙනවා.
His son Sanjaya has been fighting cancer for 3 years. But recently, the 19-year-old had a scare, facing the danger of treatments being disrupted. His plight is a window into Sri Lanka's economic crisis. Even though healthcare is free, a cut in public spending means that even if you have a prescription, medication might be out of stock. With 80% of medications imported, inflation and the falling rupee have seen prices spike on the open market. Sanjaya's family have been struggling to find and pay for life-saving drugs.
බැරිම අවස්ථාවේ තමයි. කියන්නේ දරුවට ගොඩක් අපහසු අමාරු වුණා. නේ හાર્ට් එක 135ට මඩු වුණා. ඒ වෙනකොට කිසිම දෙයක් කරගන්න හැකියාවක් තිබ්බේ නැහැ.
Sanjaya and his father, like many others, have found help at the Indira Cancer Trust. It's a non-governmental organization running about 20 programs for cancer patients. Recently, they've been buying medication for an increasing number of patients who have nowhere else to turn.
Every day, patients walk in here. If the medicine is not available in the hospital, they come here asking for help. The pricing of medicines have actually gone up about 3 to 4-fold. So if I look at a medicine that was, say, 6,000 earlier, it will be about 18,000 now. And you need different cycles depending on the type of cancer. So it's basically lakhs of money that you need for a complete course. So it's a lot of money for a single family to bear, and also it's not a single. It is needed monthly or every 2 weeks. Inflation, economic crisis, dollar situation, the political unrest, all this has actually played a huge impact on medicines.
But the Trust's budget is barely enough to buy medication for 100 patients each month. So they help each person, like Sanjaya, only once. His father says he has no choice but to keep asking for help. He's only able to work intermittently, selling food as he takes care of his son.
තාම එහෙම ස්ථිර මේකක් නැහැ තව දරුවත් එක්ක ගිල්ල දැන් එයා සනීප කරගෙන ගිහිල්ලා තමයි මොන හරි ව්‍යාපාරයක් කරන්න වෙන්නේ මොන හරි බිස්නස් එකක්.
This father knows he will have to borrow from family members for the next dose of medicine for his young child. Inflation and fuel shortages have also increased travel costs for the family, as they make frequent visits to Colombo for treatment. He's now considering more drastic measures to cope with expenses.
කිසිම සැලැස්මක් නැහැ ඇත්තටම. මොකද ලොකු අවුලක දැන් ඉන්නේ ඇත්තටම. ඒ කියන්නේ ඇත්තටම මගේ මූලික අරමුණ තමයි දරුවා. ඉතින් ඇත්තටම ලොකු ප්‍රශ්න ගොඩක් තියෙනවා. ඉතින් බැරි වුණොත් මගේ දැන් මගේ අම්මගේ තාත්තගේ ඉඩමක් තියෙනවා. ඒකේ තමයි ගියක් හදලා තියෙන්නේ. දැන් ඒක හරි මම විකුණලා මේ දරුවා වෙනුවෙන් මම මේව කරනවා. වෙන විකල්පයක් ඇත්තටම නැහැ. මොකද මේ හෘද සාක්ෂියම කතා කරන්නේ. ඊට පස්සේ මගේ අම්මගේ තාත්තා වෙනම ගියක් තියෙනවා. කියන්නේ දැන්ට මගේ අම්මගේ තාත්තා තමයි දරුවෝ දෙන්න බලාගන්නේ. ලොකු දෙන්නා. එහෙට හරි යනවා. ඒ කියන්නේ මොකද මම මේ ප්‍රශ්නේ හින්දා ගොඩක් කියන්නේ ආර්ථිකයෙන් ගොඩක් වැටලා ඉන්නේ.
For now, a small reprieve for these families. They'll have free lodging and food provided by the trust for those travelling with their sick children to the capital for treatment. A community kitchen was also refurbished to feed more cancer patients, and groceries are given out for cancer-stricken families in need.
We saw people walking into our office saying, we don't have anything to eat. Can we please get something to eat? And also we wanted to take something home. When a patient walks in, when you talk to them, it's very difficult to turn them back. So our effort is to raise more funds to help more patients.
Angry street protests demanding then-President Gotabaya Rajapaksa step down. Queuing for days for fuel. Shortages of food. This was Sri Lanka after the government ran short of foreign currency reserves in 2022. To understand how badly the crisis affected families, researchers conducted a survey from the north to the south of the country after the debt default.
4 million people have fallen into poverty over the past 4 years, and then say 7 million Sri Lankans are currently living in poverty. That's a third of the population. Usually when you look at why poverty rates have increased, it's due to one of two things. It's one, because their expenditures have increased, or it's because their incomes have gone down. And in fact, I think in Sri Lanka, both have happened.
At first glance, life now looks normal in Sri Lanka. Fuel is still rationed, but the queues are gone. Inflation fell to single digits from 70% more than a year ago. There's food in the markets. But according to the survey, more and more families can't afford to buy what they need. Almost half of those surveyed limited meal portions. People also ate fewer meals.
Fathers, for example, will go out and earn a small bit of money. That's not enough to feed the entire family. So the parents will cook and then they will allow their children to eat.
Adding to the financial stress, the government has raised taxes by as much as 36% and removed energy subsidies to raise its revenues. This is part of the bailout deal with the International Monetary Fund, negotiated by President Ranil Wickremesinghe after Parliament elected him in July 2022. As part of the deal, Sri Lanka must also restructure its debt. It's asking creditors, both domestic and external, for a 30% cut. The external debt is owed to multilateral lenders like the IMF, bilateral lenders like China and India, and international sovereign bonds, which Sri Lanka issued, promising interest and the face value after a number of years. Just what went wrong? While Sri Lanka has hefty exports, including tea and seafood, a combination of factors would deplete its foreign reserves and revenue.
Deficit in the fiscal account and deficit in the balance of payment. So twin deficit problem was the main reason for the crisis in Sri Lanka. Creating a huge budget deficit and financing this budget deficit using domestic and international sources. Now, if we borrow money just for the recurrent expenses, pay salaries, then how do we prepay loans?
The country is a magnet for tourists who brought in foreign currency. But terror attacks in 2019 slowed arrivals. That same year, tax cuts would further deplete revenues as foreign debt and interest payments mounted. By 2020, as the pandemic slowed economies, Sri Lanka wouldn't be able to borrow from capital markets as its creditworthiness dipped.
We had got used to rolling over interest service payments on it. When market access dried up, when Sri Lanka's credit rating started to tumble, clearly we were on the brink of a major financial crisis.
In 2021, a year before default, 70% of Sri Lanka's revenues went on interest payments. Unable to service foreign debt repayments of about $4 billion in 2022, Sri Lanka defaulted. Sri Lanka is not alone. Fitch Ratings says sovereign defaults are at a record high. 8 other countries have defaulted since 2020.
So Sri Lanka is a microcosm of the broader pattern of accumulation of debt in developing countries. They were allocating around 6% of GDP, so half of their government revenues, to pay interest on their debt, right? So for every dollar that Sri Lanka received, more than 50% was going to pay interest. The UN published this report called A World of Debt, where we identified that there are at least 3.3 billion people that live in countries that are spending less on health or education that they are spending on interest.
Debt distress may stem from national policies, but that's not the full story.
Over the last 3 years, we had a series of shocks that have affected the capacity of developing countries to repay back their debts. These include COVID, which created a massive economic shock, the war in Ukraine that pushed up substantially both food and energy prices, and we also have actions of central banks in advanced economies that have increased the cost of credit.
The IMF is seeing 70 countries as potentially the next Sri Lankas out there, and we really have to act and act urgently.
In Sri Lanka's case, a bird's-eye view of a southern town reveals the complex economic landscape.
We borrowed too much money at very high interest rates in dollar terms, in short maturity, and invested in non-revenue generating infrastructure projects. For Sri Lanka, at one point, our debt servicing was 100% of our revenue.
How much of Sri Lanka's debt servicing went to its biggest bilateral creditor, China? We'll have the inside story on the port that sparked accusations about debt trap diplomacy. Hambantota is nestled on Sri Lanka's southern coast. It's known for fishing, agriculture, and salt. But it's also a few nautical miles away from one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world.
So there was a very strategic plan, a nicely drafted strategic plan to develop Hambantota as a strategic hub. There were several elements of that, and number one was port.
Sri Lanka secured over $1 billion from China's Export-Import Bank, and construction of the port began in 2008. Around the same time, all across Hambantota, large buildings rose out of the jungle, linked by a little-used highway, all built with Chinese loans. The leaders at the time borrowed to develop their home district of just 600,000 people. For one shop owner in Hambantota, the development was the start of the decline of his business.
ගුවන් තොටුපළ නැහැ. MRC එක නැහැ. මේවා දැන් තිබුණයි කියලා අපිට දැන් පිටින් ඉඳලා සෑහෙන කට්ටිය කියනවා ඔයගොල්ලෝ මෙහෙම නගරෙක ඉන්න කියලා. ඉතින් ඇත්තටම අපි තමයි දන්නේ ඉතින් මේ ටික තියෙනවා ලස්සනට. අපිට මේකෙන් කිසිම මේකක් එන්නේ නැහැ කියලා ආදායමක් එන්නේ නැහැ කියලා.
Tony runs 2 shops in Hambantota town. He says business slowed down when construction of the port started. Where the harbour is now, there used to be a road to the town, but when the port was cut into the coast, it cut into the road as well.
එතන මේක ඉතිහාසගත ලෙනාඩ් වුල්ෆ්ස් ජීවත් වෙච්ච මේක මේ ඉතාමත් වැදගත් නගරයක් තමයි මේ හම්බන්තොට. වෙනම පාරක් දාලා තියෙනවා බයිපාස්. දැන් මේ රටේ ජනතාවට මේ හම්බන්තොට නගරයක් කියලා නගරයක් තියෙනද කියලා දන්නේ නැහැ.
Decentralization of services was another blow. He used to make his money from people who shopped when they came to town for administrative services or to visit relatives in hospital. The hospital has since been moved some 3 kilometers away, and other services even further out. Foot traffic dwindled. Then came the economic crisis, which meant people bought less. He's had to trim staff from 8 employees to just 2, and he's worried about whether he can keep his shops going at all. Home for Tony is a reminder of a more prosperous time. Now it's all about trimming expenses. He has 4 children to feed and educate.
මාස විතරම හරිම අමාරුයි. අපි ඉතින් දැන් හැමදේම අපේ අවම කරගෙන තමයි යන්නේ. මාස් කිලෝයක් ගත්තා නම් දැන් 500යි ගන්න.
His wife has been pawning her jewelry to tide them through.
ඒ කියන්නේ දැන් ක්‍රමවේදයක් තියෙන්න ඕනේ. දැන් පරිපාලකවරුන්ට ගෙනිච්ච නම් හොස්පිටල් එකේ ගෙනිච්ච නම් එයත් එක්ක මේ සංවර්ගන ඒ ආවට ජීවත් වෙච්ච පිරිසක් ඉන්නවනේ මේ ව්‍යාපාරිකයෝ. මේගොල්ලන්වත් shift කරන්න ඕනේ ඒකත් එක්කම. දැන් ඒ ටික ගෙනියලා ව්‍යාපාරිකයන් වෙනම.
Even before we complete the harbour, and then we started constructing roads, we started constructing conference halls, we started constructing airport. Then what happened to the feasibility, financial feasibility of all these projects?
Well, China's lending's been largely focused on infrastructure, and there are massive infrastructure gaps in the global economy. At least you know that the financing is going towards things that cause longer-term growth.
About 10 minutes' drive from Hambantota town stands the hub of the port, the starting point of development in the area. The port's current operators say they are contributing to the Sri Lankan economy and the local community.
When we took over the port in 2017 December, they had 330 something employees. Today we have 1,100, all local. We have only 18 expats. Marine services bring in a lot of money. Ship comes and just lays at the berth, we give an idle berth. So it's money not only for us, it's money for the villagers. They provide the channeling services, whatever the vegetables or meats or whatever the ship wants, the food. So channelers make money, then engineering people, they come and make money.
The port had a rocky start. As it opened, Sri Lankan authorities had to ask China for more money, a $40 million loan, to clear an unexpected obstacle.
They found that there was a massive rock at the seabed and the ships couldn't really basically dock at that port.
But after the entrance to the harbour was cleared, the port was still losing money. Unable to implement their plan of growing the port business, Sri Lanka's authorities leased the port to a Chinese state-owned company in 2017 for over $1 billion. Sri Lanka used the money to pay off Western creditors. That lease sparked off accusations of a debt trap from certain quarters in the US and UK, of too much credit being extended, and a failure to repay used to extract concessions.
真正产生斯里兰卡危机的是长期以来斯里兰卡的本身的经济的停滞，而对债务偿还能力的被迫违约，以及欧美国家过去那么多年来在斯里兰卡的很多债务引发的。所以西方国家的这个甩锅呀，实际上甩锅中国呀，实际上是在掩盖自己在这些国家的真正的罪责。
It was our decision to implement those projects. We really didn't have the affordability to continue to pay that loan. So as a result, at that point, we had to invite international partners.
Those partners would be China Merchant Port Holdings, which was already successfully operating a terminal in Colombo. Hambantota International Port Group focused on roll-on, roll-off, also known as ro-ro, ships designed to carry wheeled freight like cars.
We have the capacity to stack up to around 40,000 vehicles. When we took over, 95% of their business was the local imports. They did not realize the value of developing this place, similar to Colombo being a transshipment hub, for this to be a ro-ro hub. And that's where we focused. And today, 99% of our business is transship. In 2017, when there were no local import ban, they had handled for a year was around 125,000. Last year, we handled 550,000, 90% transshipment. This year's projection is around 700,000, it's about a 20% growth we are looking at.
The port's financiers are the Chinese, who are Sri Lanka's biggest bilateral lender. China's share of Sri Lanka's external debt is about 20%, including financing from Exim Bank and loans for state-owned enterprises.
But other than China, we have so many other sources we can get money or investment for projects like this, like Hambantota development project. But the thing is, those loans are not easy to obtain, and there are a lot of conditions to use the loan for the intended purpose, and there are follow-ups. So then from our side, we decide, okay, we don't want to go with that kind of restrictions. We want to freely use money, so we go with China.
China is also Sri Lanka's biggest investor, and its companies continue to invest in the country. China Merchant Group, the parent company of China Merchant Port Holdings, is building a logistics complex in Colombo Port. The announcement in May of 2023 was the first major foreign investment since the debt default. But why does China put its money in Sri Lanka?
Well, we have a lot of our ports, terminals, etc., being operated by companies associated with China, India, Japan, energy sector. There's a lot of investments from these countries as well. Sri Lanka is, in some sense, very strategically located. And that's, in some sense, is the reason why we've found ourselves being, at the negotiating end on many of these deals.
Adjacent to the port project in Colombo, another Chinese state-owned company is developing a tax-free special economic zone on reclaimed land, extending out from the capital's business district. In order to pay for the reclamation of the land, Sri Lanka needed an investment of over $1 billion. But this time, the deal was different.
Sri Lanka didn't put any investments into it. The Colombo Port City initial agreement was that China would be given a freehold land.
Chinese President Xi Jinping launched the construction of the project in 2014, showing how important it was to China. But while China invested heavily, it would be subject to Sri Lanka's terms, including changes to the lease agreement.
When we had a change of government in 2015, there was a decision to revisit that agreement, and they converted it to a 99-year lease rather than giving an outright leasehold, on concerns that there should be national ownership over land. So the point is, do we have the negotiating power, even when these leases come up, to say, no, we're not renewing, or, we'd like to take it back?
As the world's largest sovereign creditor, attention is focused on how China responds to debt restructuring requests, including from Sri Lanka. According to one study, China would lend more or roll over its debt rather than restructure it. The research was done by the World Bank and other institutions. So what will China do as Sri Lanka restructures its debt?
中方一贯支持本国金融机构同斯里兰卡方面积极协商债务处置方案，愿意同有关国家和国际金融机构一道，为斯里兰卡应对当前困难、缓解债务负担、实现可持续发展发挥积极作用。同时，我们也呼吁商业和多边债权人共同参与斯里兰卡的债务重组，公平分担责任。
But are repayments for Chinese loans the biggest financial burden for Sri Lanka? As we know, Chinese loans to Sri Lanka make up about 20% of external debt. If we deconstruct Sri Lanka's debt further, Sri Lankan scholars calculated that repayments for Chinese loans took up 20% of external debt servicing in 2021. But the biggest drain? Repayments for international sovereign bonds. At 47%, this is more than double the external debt servicing for China.
If we remove this from our portfolio, assume we don't have ISBAs, we can easily manage all the Chinese funded projects from our foreign exchange revenues. Then we don't have an issue.
The challenge of reaching a deal with all its creditors. Could Sri Lanka's negotiations set a precedent for other countries in debt distress? Is there light at the end of the tunnel for Sri Lanka? Food and fuel shortages eased after the country received $330 million from the International Monetary Fund. It's part of a $2.9 billion financial lifeline negotiated by the president.
The world has to know where we stand.
But the next step for the IMF bailout hit a roadblock over revenue targets, which Sri Lanka did not meet. The president is an old hand at dealing with the IMF. The last time in 2016, during one of his 6 tenures as Prime Minister. But will he be able to ensure a successful outcome of this 17th application for IMF help?
All 16 times, if you look at our track record, we haven't really delivered what we promised. In about, I think, 8 to 9 cases, we haven't completed the program. The only difference is all 16 times before, our debt was sustainable. On the 17th time, our debt wasn't sustainable. So this debt restructuring has to be the first and the final one for Sri Lanka. When you do it, you better do it properly.
It will be very important to maintain the reform momentum. The purpose of the program is to arrest the economic crisis and restore macroeconomic stability and also debt sustainability.
The IMF says Sri Lanka's debt will be sustainable if it brings it down to 95% of GDP. The ratio compares how much a country owes versus its annual economic output, or how many years it will take to pay off debt if all the GDP is used.
Even after the restructuring, Sri Lanka could end up paying around 5% of their GDP per year on interest, which means a very small reduction from their current levels of interest payments. There is a substantial problem with the approach to debt sustainability used by the IMF, because precisely this sort of analysis only focuses on how to mobilize resources to pay back creditors. What matters is what happens to people. So that's why we think that it's key to focus more about what does the debt problem represents for development, how this is affecting billions of lives, not only now, but for decades to come.
Elections are also looming in Sri Lanka, and with that, the question of how politicians will approach unpopular reforms.
My concern is that there's still a lot of political uncertainty in the country. I think there's some people in government might think that adopting these reforms at this time may damage their political position, their ability to get elected. Sri Lanka has a tradition of, during election time, of what I would call competitive populism. Back in the 1970s, when they had a rice subsidy, literally every party would run on a platform that if elected, they would increase the rice subsidy. So you got to a point where the rice subsidy was 70% of government expenditure. Investors are waiting to see whether this government is serious about these reforms.
But one thing was clear from the nationwide protests in 2022.
The interesting thing to me is that they put the blame squarely on the government. They could have blamed the COVID crisis, they could have blamed the Ukraine crisis, but they didn't. They said, this is your fault.
The IMF bailout of $2.9 billion US seems inadequate compared to Sri Lanka's debt servicing needs alone of $4 to $5 billion US a year. But the deal will help Sri Lanka restore creditor confidence and pave the way to access capital markets again. But will Sri Lanka be able to avoid going back to the IMF or even another default?
History shows and the academic evidence shows that the conditions that the IMF puts on getting this financing aren't so great for the longer run. They're an important shot in the arm now, but they're misaligned with the ability to make the kinds of investments in a country to put it back on a path that this won't happen again. It's almost the opposite of what we do in the advanced economies. When we have a crisis, we lower interest rates and spend a lot of money to get growth back on track, and then ease that away as the private sector comes back in and feels more comfortable. The IMF in Sri Lanka has done the opposite.
What happens when there's no IMF? So when a government has no access to financing, it needs to do at least one of three things. Cut expenditures with all the consequences for the recipients of these funds. It could access markets domestically, which in Sri Lanka led to very high interest rates, or it can access funding from the central bank, which leads to very high inflation. So the IMF is here to alleviate this situation and turn things around.
Now, what is the end goal of the IMF program? They say by the time the IMF program will be over in 4 years, Sri Lanka will be able to again go and borrow $1.5 billion US in the international capital markets. Is that our priority? Is it to go back to the international creditors? Sri Lanka is going through now a debt restructuring process. How did we get here? We got here because of excess debt, particularly commercial borrowing in the international capital markets, what are called international sovereign bonds. Those international sovereign bonds, which we started floating in 2007, the average interest cost is about 7.5%. In dollars, so if you take a dollar loan for 10 years at 7.5%, by the time you repay it, the interest cost is equal to the principal. That's how Sri Lanka got into a debt trap.
Restructuring international sovereign bonds might be the most difficult issue as the Sri Lankan government tries to bring all the creditors to the table.
They're not acting because they don't want to set precedent, and they're not acting because their governments aren't really asking them to.
International sovereign bonds are sold in global financial markets. So that means that you can have potentially thousands of creditors spread around the world holding the debt of a specific country. So if you were to do a debt restructuring, you basically, and you were to include everybody that owes a piece of the, that holds a piece of the debt, you need a stadium basically to fit everybody in the same place. Whereas countries such as Sri Lanka has to deal with the situation where they have less than 1 month of imports in terms of international reserves, where they have food shortages, fuel shortages, medicine shortages. Whereas you have a creditor in London or New York, they really don't care about what happens in the country as long as they get their money back. So that's why we end up having a situation where there is already a court proceeding against Sri Lanka in New York to try to force the country to pay back their loans instead of dealing with a constructive solution.
When Hamilton Reserve Bank sued Sri Lanka, it cited hardship to its investors, suffering massive losses up to 80% of their investments if it wasn't repaid. The bonds are also held by other private foreign creditors, raising the question of whether this debt crisis will affect the global financial landscape.
Most economists don't think that it'll spread into the more advanced economies, but we're already seeing it spread across Africa, parts of Latin America, and Asia too. The epicenter of the 2008 crisis was really in the advanced economies. It had reverberations, but not massive crises across the world. I think this time it's the flip. It's developing countries are going to be the epicenter of it. We will feel it in the advanced economies, but not as acutely, unless, of course, we don't act.
Sri Lanka's struggles to restructure its debt have revealed an urgent gap in the global financial system. There's no protection for countries that go bankrupt. But is there anything that nations in debt distress can do? Sri Lanka has been urgently piecing together a complex debt restructuring deal with a multitude of lenders. Just after the historic default, 182 economists and development experts called for Sri Lanka's lenders to take a different approach. Economist Dr. Jayati Ghosh was one of them.
The impetus for our letter on Sri Lanka was really to recognize that this is not a sustainable debt, that this is a debt that will have to be written down to a significant extent in order to be repaid at all. And that if you don't write it down, you're really not only putting Sri Lanka on a terrible trajectory of declining economic activity and causing immense suffering to ordinary people, but you're not going to have a payable debt even after 5 years.
Developing countries pay much more for their debt than developed countries. A report by the UN Conference on Trade and Development says countries in Africa borrow at much higher rates than the US and Germany.
So why do they have to pay this higher debt? Because they're seen as higher risk. But here's the interesting thing. Not only are they paying much higher amounts for their debt, but then when the risk fructifies, then the private creditors say, we insist on being paid in full. We will not restructure. So there's a real problem because we don't have a system of sovereign debt restructuring globally, but it's absolutely essential.
The concern is that as a global community, we don't have an answer to those countries in terms of telling them, well, if you cannot pay your bills tomorrow, this is the process to follow. The idea is fairly simple in the sense of we have bankruptcy courts that operate at the national level. We need a similar system for countries.
We have seen that when any financial institution is seen to be important, let's say Silicon Valley Bank in the US or Credit Suisse in Switzerland, then the response is rapid, it's flexible, it's generous. You know, people work over weekends, they do it overnight. Somehow countries have to be seen as important, and they can only do that if they combine, if they get together and they have a coordinated approach.
The focus in Sri Lanka has been on getting its finances in order, but there are winds of change at a grassroots level. Political economist Ahilan Kadigama has been working with cooperatives to revive the economy in the north after nearly 3 decades of civil war. That work has become even more urgent with the economic crisis.
According to the World Food Program, they did a rapid survey. Unskilled workers' incomes have halved, but food costs have doubled. So effectively, they only have 1/4 the amount of money in real terms to purchase food. So I think our policymakers, our economists think that Sri Lanka can rewind to 2018, before the economic crisis, before the COVID crisis, before the Easter attacks, and go back to borrowing from international actors, investing in urban infrastructure and real estate and just focusing on the tourism industry. And somehow life can go back to where it was, where we import luxury vehicles, import all the goods that we need, and in the hope that somehow we can increase our exports. I really doubt we can go back to where we were. No point talking about an economic recovery if people are starving.
Fish auctions kick off in the morning in Jaffna. Fishermen haul their catch before traders, hoping for a good price.
Price is the most important thing for fishermen because they've been out all night, they're coming in the morning, they're very tired, they just want to get rid of the fish. So then the traders will try to buy it from them for a song. So the cooperative, by organizing this auction, somebody has to organize it.
If the offers are too low, the fishermen can sell the catch to the cooperative instead. Anyone can join in the bidding. Fishermen also have an insurance scheme of sorts. They can donate a part of their catch into this blue bucket. The contents of the blue bucket are sold at the end of the auction. That money is used as a safety net for the fishermen if they fall sick.
For this whole basket, I ended up paying about 9,100 rupees. Now, of course, in the Jaffna market, all of this will go for about 25,000.
The cooperatives also dry and sell fish.
This is we call it sea chicken. People don't eat it. People used to throw this fish, but now it's getting a good price. It's nice and tough like a meat. Very popular in the south. And now with the economic crisis, dry fish we can't import because we don't have enough foreign exchange. So there's a market for dry fish all over the country. For inland areas where refrigeration is not possible, dry fish is important because 70% of our animal protein comes from seafood. If you look at in the decade before the crisis, we were on the average exporting about 200 to 250 million US dollars worth of seafood. So fishermen were encouraged to get into high-value seafood species, blue swimming crab, sea cucumber. Of course, they bring in valuable foreign exchange through exports. But what is ironic and sad is that we were importing, again, on the average, about 200 million US dollars worth of seafood, but much higher quantities because this is low-value seafood like sprats, which people use in their cooking.
Sri Lanka's economic crisis took a toll on agriculture and rice production. The country was 90% self-sufficient in rice. But the sudden fertilizer ban during the economic crisis meant that rice production dropped by 40%, and prices still haven't stabilized.
There are 500 cooperative shops in the northern province, shops like this. So if we can supply the rice to all those shops, we'll be able to capture maybe 3% or 5% of the rice market. Then we can become a price setter, both for the farmers and the consumer. And at least then people won't starve.
There's a big push to increase milk production as well.
Sri Lanka is only 40% self-sufficient in milk. If you collect milk 12 hours apart, you would actually end up getting maybe 60% more milk for the entire day.
The milk has a shelf life of a few hours, so the cooperatives run collection centers in the morning and evening.
Now, if you look at what the cooperatives are doing, they collect milk from the farmers at 200 rupees a liter and sell it to the consumers at 220 rupees. If you go to the local supermarket and you look at 1 liter of sterilized milk, It's now 550 rupees, almost 2.5 or triple the price, which is completely unaffordable to people. Rice, milk, fish. This is what people in Sri Lanka depend on for their nutrition. Of course, cooperatives can't do everything, but at least in terms of getting food onto people's plate, I think they have a huge role to play. The global system is broken. So a crisis like this, it's time to take stock. What can we produce locally? Because we can't allow our import bill to run away. That is where we got into this crisis. We need to change our built environment. So public transport, so that it's cheaper, affordable, then our fuel bill will also decrease. We'll be able to save foreign exchange. If we can have a robust wealth tax, we can invest it in this kind of reconstruction of the economy. There are over 50 to 70 countries around the world who are going through debt distress like Sri Lanka. And the way out of this crisis for Sri Lanka might also set an example for many other countries.
Sri Lanka's at a crossroads, and the way out of this crisis lies in answering some tough questions. What's next after the IMF program? What policies will turn the economy around? And what will the next election bring? The answers could set the country on a path to recovery, or return it to a debt trap.